everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Emerson College Polling. Matt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Brittany.
Emerson College Polling, Pix 11 and The Hill has their final poll on New York City's mayoral race. And this is a local primary that has really garnered national attention, with even a former president weighing in and endorsing one of the candidates. Early voting has begun, and Election Day is tomorrow, Tuesday, June 24th. And this race has really changed in the last 3 months since you and I started talking about it back in March. So what are your takeaways of what the poll says right now?
Yeah, Brittany, the polling has really changed over the past few months, and I think the story there is really Mamdani. So in the first round of voting, asking folks their first choice, Cuomo does still have a lead, but it's only 3 points. So we have him at 35%, Mamdani at 32%, Lander at 13%. Everyone else is under 10%, and then just 4% are undecided on that first ballot. So, as you said, things have changed a lot. I think Mamdani started out in our polling at around 1%. He's now at 32% in the first ballot, and we have very few undecided here. There's not much to say about them. There are more folks who don't have necessarily second, third, fourth, or fifth choices, but we see that does ultimately end up benefiting Mamdani in final voting.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because if there was not ranked choice voting in this race, it seems like Cuomo would eke ahead based on the numbers you have now. But remind us how ranked choice really factors in here and shakes up this race.
Yeah, it definitely shakes things up. So folks are asked, and we asked it just as they will be asked on election day, for their first, second, third, fourth, and fifth choice on the ballot. And in the final round, which is the eighth round in this case, we find that Mamdani receives 52% of the vote, Cuomo 48%, after all of those first, second, et cetera choices have been reallocated as the lowest scoring candidate is removed from the previous ballot. So, if we look back at the seventh round, just before the final round, we have Cuomo at 41, Mamdani at 39, and Lander at 20. So the real crux here is that these Lander voters are ultimately voting for Mamdani as their second choice.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because earlier in this race, Mamdani and Comptroller Brad Lander cross-endorsed each other. So I know that Comptroller Lander is saying, put me as number one, put Mamdani as number two. That strategy is seemingly helping both of them and hurting Cuomo then, correct?
That's right. We see that in that final round, those Lander voters who are eliminated and reallocated, they're backing Mamdani by about a 2-to-1 margin versus Cuomo. So it's not exactly a 1-to-1 sort of conversion of Lander voters to Mamdani, but it is definitely helping Mamdani here. We see overall that Lander is up a little bit, I think, due to the press coverage from last week. So I think he's definitely benefited from that. And ultimately, that will end up benefiting Mamdani. Again, 4-point lead in that final voting tally.
Matt, this race really seems to be a tale of two headlines. I want to read the headline from our conversation at the end of March. This is what our YouTube headline was. New poll shows Cuomo's lead widening in NYC mayoral race. Then this is our headline from the end of May at our conversation then. Could Andrew Cuomo lose New York City Democratic mayoral primary to Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani? What happened here when it comes to Cuomo's race and when it comes to the surge that Mamdani has really seen?
Yeah, it really is incredible, huh? Just those two different headlines. We've seen a meteoric rise for Mamdani here. We did have a higher undecided rate, back in March, but I think we've seen people just sort of taking a position here. Mamdani has benefited from a lot of press coverage, and meanwhile, Cuomo we've seen sort of stuck at that 35% mark. He really hasn't moved on past that, certainly not since last month. And in this poll, that's exactly where he is. So he has not expanded his lead really with any demographics. If anything, he's bled a little bit from some of the older voters, especially. We see more of them now backing Mamdani than we did previously. So there's just been a little bit of melt for Cuomo everywhere. He's not been able to break out past that 35% mark in the first ballot. And as long as he's not able to do that, it's going to be a really tough race for him.
So it seems like what you're saying, Cuomo has essentially plateaued. He has reached a ceiling here. We've seen Mamdani surge from essentially, I believe it was 1 or 2%, to essentially almost tying, and in ranked choice voting, essentially beating out Cuomo. When you see the surge at the end of a campaign cycle, does that translate to votes? Does that excitement have a ceiling as well? What does that really look like?
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable question to ask every single time, whether that's actually going to mean that this candidate receives votes in the end. Now, what's interesting here is that if we look at the early vote in this poll, we asked folks if they were very likely to vote or if they had already voted. We look at that already voted number, and we see that Mamdani is winning them by a 2-to-1 margin. So if I'm the Cuomo camp, that's pretty alarming. I think that momentum really is translating to votes here. We've seen that it's been a historic early voter turnout, and by this measure, Mamdani is winning those folks.
And the Trump administration has certainly been in the news a lot in recent weeks, whether it be the tariffs, immigration, most recently this weekend with the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities. Do those types of events, those national events, does that impact this race here, or is this race coming down to local issues?
I think that it probably will have a limited effect, at least on folks who are turning out on election day, perhaps. But I think that this really does come back mostly to local issues. Again, this is a Democratic primary, so we're not necessarily going to see the national reflection like we would if it were a general election, even at the statewide level. So it might have a limited effect, but I really think this is more about local issues, it's about the personalities, and it's about the campaigns, which have been very different. I think we've seen something very new from the Mamdani campaign, and that's clearly resonating with some folks here.
And early voters, as you said, are supporting Mamdani over Cuomo. And does it hurt, do you think, Cuomo, that this primary election is in an off election year? And do you think it's coming down to just turnout alone?
Yeah, so normally I would say that it would help Cuomo for sure. His camp is more so the older voters, and those are usually the highest propensity voters, the folks that will turn out on election day or even before then, casting either an absentee or early ballot. In this case, I think it is a little bit different, just because it is at the city level, and the fact that there are so many eyes on it this year. And, we're just following a presidential election cycle. I think that there's a lot more interest in this race than there would be in a normal off-cycle election. So normally I would say that it would benefit someone like Cuomo, especially. But in this case, I'm not so sure that it does.
And there's the smallest sliver of voters that are undecided, less than a day out from election day here, 4%. You're saying they don't matter. Why not?
Well, I'm not saying that they don't necessarily matter, but it is a very small number at this point, and I think we can see the trends in the data. If we allocated those undecided voters to, the candidates equally, it wouldn't really change the final tabulation. I think it will matter how folks end up ranking the ballot. We talked about this last time. People don't necessarily have a fifth choice in this race. So how folks ultimately end up ranking their ballots, that will make a difference. We do see some drop off from the first to the final round in voting here, simply because folks just don't necessarily have choices between Mamdani and Cuomo. So, there's a little bit more of an undecided factor here than the top line number sort of suggests. But at the end of the day, I think we do see the trends. And I think we have a decent idea that this is going to be a close race.
And I think that just how close this race is now becoming and who the top two candidates are a real case study for the Democratic Party and where they're going next. Because you have the young, more progressive candidate in Mamdani. He's a Democratic Socialist versus the more moderate Governor Andrew Cuomo. He's making his political comeback here. Democrats have really had to look inward since their 2024 loss. Some Democrats have told me that the party needs to move more towards the center. They need to become more moderate. Other Democrats have told me they need to really lean into more left issues. They need to lean into being more progressive. As a pollster here, when you're reading the numbers here, does this give you any insight of where the Democratic Party is headed next?
Yeah, and I've seen some commentary about this and looking at more progressive candidates versus more moderate candidates. And I don't want to extrapolate too much from this race. I think it's a special race. It is New York City, which is very different from the rest of the country. So I wouldn't necessarily want to make too many generalizations here. But in general, I don't think we've seen a lot of progressive candidates have success in general elections at a competitive level, where you say swing state. That's not to say that these candidates can't win, but we haven't seen that yet. We've seen more so these moderate candidates ultimately have success. Now, when we look at the general election here in New York City, that may not be the case. It might be that a progressive candidate could win as on the ticket, depending on what that ticket ultimately looks like. And I know that both Cuomo and Mamdani are likely to be on the ballot regardless of these results. So I think we might actually see a test of this towards the end of the year.
Well, Matt, we certainly have a very close race to look out for. Thank you so much for your polls, for breaking it down with me. I hope to have another conversation soon.
Me too. Thanks so much, Brittany.